Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. You may already be familiar with the Serenity Prayer, a kind of mantra that is used by 12 step groups whose members are fighting their way back from addictions to alcohol, drugs, or overeating. But did you know that the prayer has its roots in Stoicism, a philosophy that goes back to the ancient Romans and Greeks? Massimo Pigliucci is professor of philosophy at City College and a practitioner of Stoicism. And in his new book, A Field Guide to a Happy Life 53 Brief Lessons for Living, he tells us how Stoicism can help us live happy modern lives. A Field Guide to a Happy Life 53 Brief Lessons for Living is published by Basic Books. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, you teach philosophy. How interested are college students in studying philosophy these days?
That's an interesting question. It varies. The first reaction often is philosophy. Why would I want to study that for? Isn't that the quintessential example of a field that doesn't have any practical application? But then if they get past that initial reaction, that knee-jerk reaction, they actually start appreciating that philosophy is about sound reasoning. It's about learning how to write and think carefully. And therefore, it's in fact a skill that is applicable to anything in life, including, of course, job opportunities and careers. So once they get into it, they really understand why it's important to study philosophy.
On the subway, I have seen posters from an organization called the School of Practical Philosophy, which promises sustainable happiness. Is that one of the points of philosophy, to teach people how to be happy?
It is, although I wouldn't necessarily apply to that particular school in order to
Okay.
learn it. Yeah, I see those ads all the time as well. Yes, in fact, philosophy has basically, the word philosophy has two meanings. On the one hand, it is a technical field of expertise in modern scholarship. It's analogous to, science, physics, biology, to English literature, and anything like that. On the other hand, it refers to a way of living. So in the second sense, we all have a philosophy of life, whether we recognize it or not. We all have certain principles that we follow. We all have certain goals that we try to achieve in life. We all think that certain things are good and other things are bad. And that is essentially having a philosophy of life.
Your book is about how to use Stoicism to understand the world, to have a happy life. What exactly is Stoicism?
Stoicism is a Greek-Roman philosophy that started about 23 centuries ago. And the way it started actually tells you quite a bit about what it is about. There was this fellow, Zeno of Citium. Citium is modern-day Cyprus. He was a merchant, a Phoenician merchant, and he was on a ship with all of his cargo. And a big storm happens, shipwreck. Zeno survives barely, but he loses all his cargo. So what does he do? He gets to Athens, which was nearby. And as we all would do after a shipwreck, the first thing he does is he gets into a bookshop. It's like, okay, he wants to sort of read something interesting. He wants to recover from his experience. And he hears the bookseller reading out loud a book called The Memorabilia by Xenophon, which is about the life of Socrates. And he gets still hit by this notion that, oh my gosh, there is philosophy is a way of living, and maybe I can actually rebuild my life by listening to what people like Socrates are saying. So he asks the bookseller, where can I find a philosopher? And the bookseller says, well, there is one right over there walking outside. Zeno follows this guy whose name turned out to be Crates of Thebes, and begins to study philosophy. 10 or 15 years later, he feels he's ready to actually start teaching philosophy of his own. And he does so in an open market in a place called the Stoa Poikile, which means a painted porch. Hence the term Stoicism. It comes from the fact that the Stoics always taught their philosophy in the middle of everything, where people actually gather, where is everybody can ask you a question or say, what should I do about this particular problem? So Stoicism is really a problem-solving kind of philosophy. It tells you, it helps you figure out how do you want to live your life, what is important in your life, and what kinds of things you should focus on.
I guess many different kinds of philosophy do that. But what drew you in particular to Stoicism? How did you get involved with it?
Yes, you're right. Every philosophy of life, and I would say even every religion, which I think all religions are essentially types of philosophies of life, uh, tries to teach you something about how to live a good life. And then they differ from each other in terms of how they actually think of what the good life is. Well, for a Stoic, the good life is one in which we live according to nature, as the Stoic motto goes. Now, living according to nature doesn't mean that we should be running into the forest naked and hugging trees, although there's nothing wrong with that. It means that we should take seriously human nature. And just like there is a good life, let's say, for every other living organism, a plant has a good life if it has plenty of light and water. A lion has a good life if it has plenty of ways to build his harem and to forage for food and so on and so forth. Human beings also are animals of a particular kind. And if we take seriously what kind of animals we are, then that gives us a clue to what a good life for a human being is. According to the Stoics, there are two fundamental things that distinguish human nature. One, we're capable of reason, which doesn't mean that we reason well all the time. It just means we're capable of doing it. And two, we are highly sociable. Even though we can survive on our own if need be, we really thrive only in social groups, in highly structured social groups with divisional labors where we can do all sorts of things. So for the Stoics, from this follows that a good human life is one in which you use reason to improve society, to make this a better world. And that is the goal of Stoicism, to become better human beings and more helpful to society at large.
Why write this book at this particular time?
For a couple of reasons. The book is, in a sense, a homage to a Stoic philosopher from the early 2nd century whose name is Epictetus. And I think that Epictetus' thinking should be more widely known because it's incredibly interesting and incredibly useful, even in the 21st century. Epictetus was an interesting character. He was born a slave in a place called Hierapolis, which is in modern-day Western Turkey. And he was brought to Rome as a slave, but he was really bright. He studied his philosophy under one of the most important and most influential Stoic teachers of the time, Musonius Rufus. He eventually was freed, became a free man, and he started teaching. And then he got on the nerves of the local emperor, Domitian, because the Stoics had this penchant for speaking truth to power, as we would say today. So that gets annoying to the powers that be. And so the Domitian just sent a bunch of Stoics, including Epictetus, in exile. Epictetus moved to northwestern Greece in Nicopolis and reestablished his school, and it became the most famous school of the early 2nd century. Epictetus also was a household name for most of the intervening 18th centuries. His books were read and studied by Christian monks that used them as manuals for spiritual exercises. Epictetus was very well known during the Renaissance and the early modern part of Western history. And in fact, almost all of the American founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, they all had a personal copy of one of Epictetus' books, the Enchiridion, which is the Manual for Life. So he was really influential throughout almost 2 millennia. And then somehow it went through an eclipse at the beginning of the 20th century. Most people haven't heard about Epictetus these days. And so part of the scope of this book is to actually bring him back because I think that his ideas really are very useful even for life in the 21st century.
So
now, why now?
It was discovering his writings that made you want to write this book?
Yes. The reason I got into Stoicism in the first place is because I was going, like lots of people, through a midlife crisis. The usual run-of-the-mill things. Divorce, my father dying, changing of career, that sort of stuff. And I was looking for some kind of framework to reorient my life at that point. And I looked into different things. I looked into Buddhism, for instance, as a philosophy of life. I looked into a couple of other possibilities, but nothing really clicked. And then one day, I discovered Epictetus, and I started reading one of his books, The Discourses. And the guy struck me as incredibly forceful, incredibly smart, very plain language, very accessible language. and even a little bit of a sense of humor, bordering on sarcasm. And so I said, wow, this is my guy. This is really interesting. So I just devoured everything that I could find about Epictetus, and here we are a few years later, trying to bring him to the general public.
You also say you wanted to update the principles of Stoicism to our modern times. So let's talk about some of the basic principles. I'll go down some that you mentioned in your book. We should focus on the things we can control, not on the things that are not within our control.
Right. You mentioned the Serenity Prayer earlier, right? And the Serenity Prayer asks God the wisdom to tell the difference between the things you can change and the ones that you cannot change, and then the courage to change what you can, and the serenity to accept what you cannot. Well, basically, that is exactly how the Enchiridion, Epictetus manual, begins, and also how my updated version, a field guide for a happy life, begins. With this notion that, look, there are certain things that are up to us, as Epictetus puts it, and other things that are not up to us. And the best way to go through life is to focus on the first, where your agency is maximized, where you can actually make a difference, where you can actually do things, and then develop an attitude of equanimity, of acceptance for whatever else comes your way, on the notion that sometimes you win in life, sometimes you don't. So for instance, let's say, let's pick a random example. We're in the middle of a pandemic. So health, according to the Stoics, is not up to us, which is a interesting concept if you think about it, because if you say, well, but wait a minute, I can do things to preserve my health. I can go to the doctor on a regular basis, preventive medicine. I can eat healthy foods. I can go to the gym. I can wear masks and practice social distance and doing these things via Zoom instead of in a studio. Yes, you can do all those things. Those are the things up to you, according to Epictetus, because they're the results of your judgments and your decisions to act or not to act. However, the outcome, what you really want, be healthy, is not really up to you, because viruses are sneaky things. You could do everything right. And, I'm a biologist also as a background. I can tell you, viruses might get you no matter what you do. You might get unlucky, right? And so the attitude of the Stoic is, well, I don't control whether in the end I'm going to get sick or not. That's not up to me. What I do control is my understanding of the situation and my acting accordingly. So let me do whatever I can in order to preserve my health, but I'm also ready mentally for the possibility that if, despite all of that, I might get sick. And in that case, I just need to deal with it as it comes.
Okay. Another principle you mentioned, everything you think you own is not actually yours.
That's one of my favorite. The Stoics, just like Buddhists, for instance, just to mention another philosophy of life that has many similarities with Stoicism, think that we don't actually own anything. The universe lends us stuff. We use a language where we say, this is my apartment, this is my wife, this is my this and my that. But in reality, all of these things are actually borrowed in a sense. It's not really your house in the sense that it could be taken away at any minute. A fire could destroy it or something. It's not your wife or your husband or your partner, because they may decide, they have their own minds. They can decide to do something else with their lives at some point. So that means for the Stoic that you should really appreciate everything you have currently and should treat it accordingly with an attitude of thankfulness for what you have. Oh, I have a roof over my head. That's great, because there are a lot of people that don't. Oh, I have the possibility of putting food on my table tonight. Well, that's great, because lots of people don't. Oh, I have a partner who loves me. That's great, because a lot of people don't. So that is what it means. And however, the converse of that, the other side of that coin, is that when you don't have those things, when those things actually do go away, let's say your loved one, one of your loved ones dies, there too, you have to accept it. You need to tell yourself, well, it wasn't mine forever. I knew that it was borrowed from the universe. I knew that this was a temporary thing, and it has been very good to have it. It's been very good to interact with that person while she was around. And now I just have to make peace with the fact that she's not.
Another principle, nothing in the world is evil, or for that matter, good. The world just is. It's up to us to decide what we want to do with whatever comes our way.
That one is one of the most difficult for people to accept. It's kind of the Stoic equivalent of the Christian, present the other cheek to you, or love your enemy, or something like that. In other words, the notion is, or the Christians actually have this saying, hate the sin, but not the sinner, right? And essentially, that's the same idea that the Stoics have, that people are not inherently evil. There is, evil doesn't exist. It's a metaphysical construct that it doesn't really help. What happens is that some people are profoundly misguided in the way in which they think. Even the worst person you can think of, they probably think that they have good reasons to do whatever it is that they're doing. Okay, they probably are mistaken, and it certainly you should stop them if you can. If they're about to hurt other people, and it is in your power to stop them, you definitely should do that. But you shouldn't add on top of this, oh, and they're evil, because that doesn't actually help. And in fact, it makes things worse, because it makes you think of the other person as somewhat subhuman, not entirely a human being. For Epictetus, people who make mistakes, people who do bad things, ought to be treated as if they were blind, or they were, incapable of doing what normal human beings do. Okay, well, if you are in the presence of a blind person, you just help them. You don't beat them up and say, oh, you bad blind person. Similarly, somebody who has a character that leads them to do something that is unacceptable, that is not good, that means his character is flawed, but he didn't ask for that character. He was born with it, the circumstances made it so, and so on and so forth. So you need to help if possible. That has incredibly wide-ranging consequences. For instance, the Stoics tend to be in favor of non-retributive systems of justice, right? Where you don't go after people with a vengeance. You try to correct people. You try to reestablish them as members of society.
Tell me, I mean, your book is about updating some of the original principles of Stoicism. Give me an example of, how one of the ancient principles was expressed and how you have updated it.
Yes, the big one there is the Stoic notion of providence. The Stoics have a notion of providence that is different from the Christian one, but it kind of serves the same purpose. So, the ancient Stoics thought that the universe is a living organism, and they actually called it God. They were, by modern standards, they were what we call pantheists. They believed that the universe is the same thing as God, okay? Now, if there is a living organism that is the universe, then we are literally bits and pieces of that living organism. And so whatever happens to us is for the good of the universe, right? Not necessarily for our own good, but for the good of the universe. Epictetus uses this wonderful metaphor. He says, imagine you're a foot and you had to step into the mud. And you're going to say to yourself, well, that's disgusting. I don't want to step into the mud. Why should I do that? But then you realize that you are not a detached foot. You're a foot attached to a body. And the body has to go home and cross a muddy path. It's your duty to step into the mud, because you are the foot. You're not another part of the organism. And so not only you should do it, you should actually be happy to do it, because you're helping the whole body. Similarly, the ancient Stoics thought, therefore, let's say somebody that is close to you dies. Well, you shouldn't just accept it as an inevitable thing. You should actually be embracing it. You should be happy about it, because somehow, you don't understand how, but somehow this is actually helpful to the universe at large, right?
Okay, so your book, it's a small book. It's meant to be a small book, I assume for a reason. How, because you want people to use it, I assume,
Yes.
to carry it around in their pocket or pocketbook. Right. How do you recommend that people use your book in going about their daily lives?
There's a couple of ways. I wouldn't open the book and go, cover to cover. This is not that kind of book. If people are interested in learning a little bit about Epictetus and a little bit about Stoicism, there is an introduction there that tells you the basics of what Stoicism is. But it's not needed. If you're curious about Stoicism, sure, by all means, go ahead. The way to use this thing is actually to open in a random, like I did, for instance. Now I'm on section 13. There's 53 sections overall. And the idea is you open it at random, whatever you have a few minutes during the day, and you read what is in that section. And then you start thinking about, well, what does that mean? And how does that apply to my life? So for instance, section 13, which I literally did open at random, says, if you wish to make progress, be happy to be considered clumsy or foolish by others with regard to externals. And then it continues. Now, what does that mean? It means that happiness does not depend on what the Stoics call externals, things like money, fame, reputation, objects, houses, and things like that. Those things, according to the Stoics, don't make you happy. They're useful things. We all want a little bit of money. We all want a house, and et cetera, et cetera. They're useful things, but they're not what makes you happy. What makes you happy is to work on your own character, to become a better person, to have relationships with other people, to have good friends, to have loved ones, to be useful to society. Now, it turns out that although this kind of notion is counterintuitive in modern consumerist and hyper-capitalistic culture like the United States, there is a lot of research in modern psychology, social psychology, that shows that the Stoics were right. Turns out, for instance, that levels of self-reported happiness don't depend almost at all from material goods. So long as people are, of course, making enough money, let's say, to put food on the table and have a roof on their head. Beyond that, more money doesn't actually increase your happiness significantly. What increases your happiness significantly are exactly the kinds of things that the Stoics are talking about: a sense of purpose in your life, projects that you care about, and relationships.
You are a former Catholic, now an atheist. There is a lot of overlap between Stoicism and the religions, correct? I mean, I
Yes.
reckon Unitarians, the whole concept of gratitude.
Right.
In Buddhism, the idea that the world is not real, it's imaginary, and so you should not focus on, and you should avoid desire. That's also a tenet, I gather, of Stoicism. Here are some scenarios that let's look at a couple that people are dealing with now, and how could one apply Stoicism to these scenarios? Can I be happy during the pandemic when so many people are sick and dying, and when so many normal human interactions are not possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot there depends on what one means by happiness. Happiness, unfortunately, is a little slippery of a word, right? If we mean by happiness, should I be elated and, be sort of like feeling really content? No, that probably would be the inappropriate reaction in a situation like this, where a lot of people are suffering. But the Stoics didn't mean that by happiness. For the Stoic, happiness is a life worth living. And so what we should ask ourselves is, am I living a life worth living? Am I doing something that is actually useful to humanity? Am I being helpful here to somebody? And that can be not necessarily humanity at large. Most of us are not in a position to be helpful at that kind of scale. But are you being helpful to your neighbors? Are you being helpful to your friends? Are you being helpful to your loved ones? Are you, volunteering in a soup kitchen, for instance, in these days where people are starving? Are you donating a little bit of your money, extra income, if you have it, so that other people can actually make it through the pandemic? Are you be of comfort to your friends and family? That is what it means living a life worth living. And in that sense, I think the Stoics would say, yes, even in the middle of a pandemic, you can have a life worth living.
There's an annual celebration of Stoicism Week. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that's actually how I discovered Stoicism in the first place a number of years ago. Turns out there is an organization called Modern Stoicism, which got started by a few people in England, mostly based in London, a number of years ago. And these are philosophers, as you might imagine, who are interested in Stoicism, but also, interestingly, cognitive behavioral therapists. Because it turns out that Stoicism influenced the beginning of cognitive behavioral therapy back in the 1960s. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is one of the most well-established evidence-based type of psychotherapy. And a lot of CBT techniques are actually updated versions of techniques that the Stoics use in their practice. So these people got together and said, these ideas are not just theoretical stuff. They might be useful to other people. So what are we going to do about it? And they said, well, why don't we organize a conference and an entire week in which people can try it out, basically. We will give them the basic tools, basic information about Stoicism. We'll give them some exercises to try out. And for a week, people will try to live like a Stoic and see if that makes a difference. So this still happens every year, usually in October. And now I'm actually on the board of that same group, Modern Stoicism. And it has really brought tens of thousands of people over the last few years to be interested in practicing Stoicism.
Okay. We only have a couple minutes left. What do you want people to take from your book?
That there is a difference between just living a life and living a good life. And that philosophy, whether it is Stoicism or Buddhism or Christianity or anything else that works for you, it doesn't really matter that much. But philosophy is a reliable guide to make a difference between just any kind of life that you go around sort of doing things at random without rhyme or reason, and a life that you get to the end of it, you look back and you say, yeah, that was actually worth doing. That was well done.
Well, I hope that in the future, you're going to see a lot of people reading your book on the subway.
That's right.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I'd like to thank Massimo Pigliucci, professor of philosophy at City College, for joining us today. His book, A Field Guide to a Happy Life, 53 Brief Lessons for Living, has been published by Basic Books and is available online and in bookstores. And to learn about our upcoming shows, be sure to follow us on Twitter at One-to-One CUNY TV. For One-to-One and the City University of New York, I'm Cheryl McCarthy.